What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today I am going to be going over Shadows of the Galaxy, the second set for Star Wars Unlimited, talking about some of the good, some of the bad, and how I think the set landed as a whole. I think it's a nice time to do a little retrospective like this before the new set. I know Thork did one as well, if you want to check that out over on his channel, but here are some of my thoughts. So, Shadows of the Galaxy was the second set for Star Wars Unlimited TCG. It wasn't focused on a specific era of the setting, but rather on an overall theme of bounty hunters, smugglers, those sorts of things. So it wasn't like, oh, this set is going to be about the sequels, or this set is going to be about, I don't know, the period between the main movies and the sequels when the Mandalorian is set or whatever. Instead, we had cards from a range of eras. There was some stuff from the Solo movie, but I think the most prevalent, maybe the most prevalent theme was stuff based on the Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, the Disney Plus TV shows. I think there were 3 new mechanics in the set: smuggle, bounty, and capture and rescue, which are kind of linked together. There were several new trait synergies. We saw some underworld synergies. We saw some bounty hunter synergies. The biggest, though, was Mandalorian trait synergy. We saw a bunch of Mandalorian stuff and Mandalorian leaders for both villainy and heroism, and a range of cards to potentially support that. And, we saw 18 new leaders for the game. No rare bases this time, but yeah, lots of new options for deck builders. And, how did it do? That's the big question. And I think there were some parts that landed really well and some parts that didn't as much. So let's go through the new mechanics first. Or actually, before we do the new mechanics, this is kind of the big factor that I think they really nailed. It's so much better than in set 1, and that was card availability. So Spark of Rebellion's launch, it was marred by shortages after a time. When the game first came out, it was quite available, but after a few weeks, there started being shortages, and after a month or so, they were pretty sold out. And there were kind of slow roll releases of individual boxes to stores, allowing them to do some drafts or allowing them to do some prize support for events and so on. But it really felt like we were constrained by card availability for a lot of Spark of Rebellion. And it seems like FFG mostly avoided that this time around. I think that they had discussed how they had increased the size of the order after seeing the huge demand for set 1. I have heard of shortages of at least some non-English sets. I remember someone saying that French cards were hard to get, for instance, and I can't speak to that in much detail, but at least for English, at least in the United States, the cards were much more available. It wasn't like, oh, stores are sold out and they can't restock ever. It felt, I could probably go to some stores and still get some Shadows of the Galaxy boosters. I think that the single card prices were also notably lower, which is a better situation for deck builders. I think that, and I think there are multiple factors involved there, but even if you look at like the strongest legendaries in the set, or at least some of the ones that are perceived as best, like Poe Dameron or the Darksaber, they aren't up at the same price levels as cards. Some of the cards from set 1, like I think Darth Vader from set 1 or Luke, for instance, is very expensive, or at least was. The prices have been coming down a bit there too, as we've seen more set 1 boxes going out, but set 2 managed to avoid the card availability issues of set 1. Limited format stayed available longer, and overall I think FFG deserves some real kudos there. They did much better on this front, and I would say the changes worked. Okay, so that's a big positive. Now we're going to move to the new mechanics. So the smuggle mechanic was very successful. It's been a hit in limited. It's been a hit in constructed. Most competitive constructed decks I make have at least some smuggle cards. The smuggle centric leaders Lando and Hondo haven't been as big, but even so, the smuggle mechanic is pretty prevalent, and I have seen people playing Lando or Hondo decks sometimes. I know George was playing some Hondo for a while. And the mechanic also leads to interesting in-game choices. There's an element of, oh, I can resource this card and then smuggle it later, or maybe I want to play it earlier for a cheaper cost. And we even have a few cards that have different smuggle costs, or different aspects when they're smuggled, or different effects when they're smuggled, like this Hotshot DL44 Blaster, one of my favorite smuggle cards and one that's been very successful competitively. You can either play it as a 1-cost aggression upgrade to give +2 power, or you can play it as a 3-cost cunning smuggle card, in which case it gives +2 power, but you also get to attack with the attached unit immediately. And this card has been a big success. I think it's best in a red-yellow deck, so that you can choose to either play it out in its normal mode or smuggle it out with no aspect penalty either way. But the smuggle version of this effect is good enough that I've been seeing people play this in I've been seeing people play this in cunning decks that don't actually have a way to play it for its base cost, and they're just going for the smuggle value. There's other smuggle cards that are also seen play. Cassian Andor is a really good card for aggression heroism decks. I think we've seen stuff like Lom Pike really widely seen. I like L3. Overall, I think that Smuggle's been pretty successful. That's not to say every smuggle card is good. There's definitely some smuggle cards that are less exciting, but as a whole, at least like the strong smuggle cards are strong enough to see play. A lot of decks are running some smuggle pieces or another, and the mechanic is actually good enough that it makes me play above the minimum number of cards in limited sometimes. So when I was playing, if I'm doing like the pre-releases or whatever it is, running out of cards in your deck can be a real thing, and Smuggle can make you go through your deck faster. So I think a good tactic in Shadows of the Galaxy Limited is to actually play more than 40 cards if you have a bunch of Smuggle and or draw things. Overall, I really like this mechanic. I hope it returns, and I think cards that have different effects when played normally or when smuggled are extra cool, as are ones that have different aspects when they are played normally versus smuggled. I think it has some really interesting deck building and gameplay decisions. Overall, I would say Smuggle was a big hit and probably the most successful of the 3 new mechanics. Next up, we have Bounty. Bounty has not been as present as Smuggle. I got a little typo there. I said Vam Smuggle. Sorry about that, guys. But it is still around. And some of the bounty upgrades like Top Target and Enticing Rewards are seen play even in decks that don't have real bounty synergies. It isn't as big as Smuggle, but it is still being included in some builds that aren't all about bounty. And the bounty-centric leader Bosk has seen competitive success in a deck that has more bounty emphasis. We've seen stuff like, the Client, Top Target, Deathmark, and Bosk's ability to potentially double a bounty and to damage units that are bountied has proven pretty strong, and he's been effective. He's been an effective leader as a kind of, a new take on kind of a villain control type deck. He has a lot of healing. He arguably even has more healing than Iden, at least if you're lining up those healing bounties and potentially doubling them. So that's been pretty cool. Some of the units with built-in bounties also see play. So like if you're playing Cunning Sabine, I think that the the Cartel Turncoat is a very strong card for that build. I was using that in the deck that I took to the San Francisco PQ. I think that if you're playing Kira, the Hylabon Enforcers have been pretty effective as well. So some of those units with the built-in bounties have seen some play. The Bounty Punisher units haven't done as well though. So those are the cards that get a bonus if your opponent has a unit with a bounty in play. So things like Reputable Hunter, I'm not really seeing the Reputable Hunter, the Haxian Brood Enforcer, things like that as often. I'm not sure if that's because the built-in bounty units aren't like as ubiquitous as they could be, or whether it's because not very many decks want to splash in like a small number of bounties and then also have cards that are dependent on those for payoffs. I don't really know, but nevertheless, bounty is definitely seeing some play. And I think it might also see even more play if we weren't in an environment where there's a lot of upgrade removal. uh, but I don't know for sure. And I'd be interested to see more bounty stuff in future sets. One thing that I think would be super cool is what if I would like to see an upgrade where it gives bonus stats and it also gives a bounty. So there's like the option of playing it on an opposing unit that you can remove even with the bonus stats, or maybe playing it on your own unit for the stats, but then the downside is your opponent's going to be able to get that bounty if they can clear your unit. I think that would be a pretty cool idea. Um, but yeah, we'll see what happens in the future with other bounty stuff. There isn't any of it in set 3. There also isn't any smuggle in set 3, but I think it's a potential cool mechanic for the future. Okay, so then next up, capture. So capture is probably the least successful of the 3 new mechanics. It's almost totally absent in constructed play, to be honest with you. It can be powerful in limited, and it's definitely relevant in limited, but it is still a bit disappointing. Rescue cards are basically never used as a result. So L337 actually does see some play, but that's because she's so good that even if her rescue ability doesn't do anything, she's still, a crafty smuggler, except you can smuggle her for 4, and also she's heroism, which is like a legitimately quite good card. I know there was some discussion from some of the designers about how capture in its original form was maybe overpowering and maybe unfun to play against. And I think it ended up getting toned down. And I wonder if maybe it ended up being toned down a little too far. Relentless Pursuit, which I've showcased here, is kind of the only capture card that I've really seen in competitive decks. And even then, it's kind of a marginal or sideboardy option in some cases. That's not to say all the other capture cards are bad, but I think the conditional nature of a lot of these cards has made them less strong than people would like. I was optimistic about legal authority, but I think the fact that the unit has to have less power made that a lot more conditional than it looked at first glance. But we do have some more capture cards on the way with Twilight. One of them is the legendary Cad Bane that captures a bunch of enemy units when you play him, but then they can potentially get them back. But when they do, you can potentially draw some cards. I think that looks really I think he looks really potentially threatening, and it'll be interesting to see if the capture mechanic gets kind of new life breathed into it with some of these new capture cards from Twilight of the Republic. It's also worth noting that I believe if you capture a token unit, the unit just dies and they can't get it back, so that might increase the value of some of these capture cards if tokens and strategies that buff tokens end up being prevalent. Overall, I think that capture is an interesting mechanic, but it did end up a little weaker than end up a little weaker than the other new mechanics, at least in constructed play. I do think it's still powerful and limited, but at least in constructed play, it hasn't really seen a lot of use. Okay. The big new trait was Mandalorian. And unfortunately, it also didn't make a huge splash, in my opinion. So Bo-Katan was a very popular leader to brew with. I think at one point FFG shared statistics where Bo-Katan was the most popular leader for people building decks on their site. But she didn't really wind up being that powerful, at least in terms of competitive play. I think the Mandalorian trait kind of lacked reliable payoffs. There wasn't any like bread and butter card like you have with Fleet Lieutenant or Wing Leader for the Rebels, where this is just like a very solid synergy card. Mandalorian Warrior is like kind of close to those two, but wasn't quite on the same power level. And there's also kind of an issue where a bunch of the Mandalorian units need synergy to be functional. By which I mean, so like let's look at this Follower of the Way. Follower of the Way is a 2-cost 1/3, and while it's upgraded, it gets +1/+1. So if you can upgrade this, it becomes essentially a 2-cost 2/4 base. So 2-cost, if it was just a 2-cost 2/4, that would be like good. That would probably be a playable card. Like it would be a good card, but it wouldn't be like insane. And like for instance, Battlefield Marine, which is a 2-cost 3/3, would probably be better than a card that was a 2-cost 2/4. And so Follower of the Way becomes a 2-cost 2/4 if you set it up, and it doesn't seem that worth jumping through the hoop in order to get a payoff that isn't really that big. Similarly, if we look at Casca Reeves, she's a 4-cost 4/5, and if she's upgraded, she can deal 2 damage to a ground unit, so on attack. And that's a good ability, but I'm not sure that it's so good that it's worth having her be a 4-cost 4/5 with no text if you don't manage to get an upgrade on her. So it didn't really feel like you could, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Like I could be off base on this, but at least to me, it feels like the Mandalorian synergies aren't. It feels like they don't quite line up, and even in the games where you're getting those upgrades on these units and getting their stronger forms and so on, it doesn't feel like you're getting like so much value. Whereas some of the other synergies that are good, like if you're playing McClunky in a deck that has a bunch of underworld units, your other units are generally already good, even if you don't draw McClunky. And if you're playing a rebel deck that has some of the rebel synergies, the rebel units that you're playing feel like they're already good, even if you don't like, even if I don't draw Wing Leader or Fleet Lieutenant, cards like Battlefield Marine or Sabine Wren Explosives Artist are still good cards. These are still cards I'm like excited to play, and the synergy makes them even better. And I think that type of thing is much more likely to be effective than cards that are like, this card is not good, but with the synergy, it becomes like, you know, this card's below average, but with the synergy, it's above average. That feels less good to me than this card's good, and with the synergy, it becomes even better. Now, I will say some of the big payoffs for the Mandalorian synergy are really good. If you can get a big board and do attacks with the Darksaber and buff a bunch of units, it's great. If you can get a big board and play the Armorer and give out a bunch of shields, it can be great. But the problem is those are like bigger kind of high-end payoffs, and there's less of the bread and butter, just like basic payoffs that I think ended up making things like the Rebel synergy so good. I could be wrong. You know, maybe someone's going to come out with a Mandalorian deck in the future also that's going to be really good. I know that people have had some success with Gar Saxon, but I think the decks that have been successful with him haven't really been leaning into the Mandalorian synergy. Although I could be wrong. I'm not like super familiar with the Gar builds, but I think generally they go for like kind of a cunning focus. Anyway, I think Mandalorian synergy is cool. I think the concept is good, and I think Mandalorians are popular in the lore. So I think it's a bit unfortunate that they maybe didn't end up being a huge competitive archetype. That being said, you know, I've had fun playing with. I have definitely had fun playing with my Bo-Katan deck, and you know, I hope in the future we'll see some cards that will you know, maybe, you know, tip the scales a bit and make that a deck that can be a strong competitor as well. So, you know, I think the Mandalorian trait synergy is cool, but it may join the Spectre synergy as something that's sort of waiting for new cards before it makes more of a splash competitively. Next up, let's discuss legendaries. So I touched on this in my previous video where I go into much more detail with a legendary tier list for set 1 and set 2, and then predictions about set 3. I'll have a link to that in the video description below if you want to check that out. But many Shadows of the Galaxy legendaries ended up as weaker cards. As a whole, not all of them, but as a whole, the legendaries in set 1 are stronger than in set 2. Even the stronger set 2 ones probably aren't really on the same level as like Luke, Vader, and so on. And I think it has weakened the secondary market prices for cards, which is both good and bad. I think some of the cards from set 1 with the shortages and some of the expensive legendaries were probably more expensive than I would like to see in the game. But at the same time, you know, there's a local store that has a lot of set 1 legendaries and few set 2 legendaries in terms of cards that they're selling as singles. And somebody told me that there wasn't very much interest in people like opening and selling them set 2 legendaries because a lot of them just aren't really all that valuable. And it can be kind of unhyped to pull a legendary but realize that it's bad. There are several legendaries from set 2 that basically don't see any competitive play at all. Things like, you know, Finalizer or Rule with Respect, which are both capture based, which is kind of funny because I was talking about the capture mechanic earlier. But not just those. The like second chance one that lets you play the same unit again has unfortunate timing. Overall, I think the legendaries weren't as strong this time as we saw in the first set. Set 3 looks like it's going to be kind of in between the two, in my opinion. Don't know for sure, but I think set 3 is going to be stronger than set 2, but probably still not as strong as set 1 when it comes to the legendaries. If you want to hear a bunch more about legendary cards, you can see my previous video, which I will link in the video description below. So let's talk organized play. In organized play, I think there were some kind of mixed results. Overall, though, I think they had some very cool stuff, and I'm pretty optimistic about it. So there was a big demand for PQ events. It was more than FFG expected at first, and these overall went relatively smoothly for the competitive launch of the game. And I know they're going to be expanding the PQ program with many more PQ events. Those are planetary qualifiers, by the way, in set 3. However, there were a few issues with underwhelming prizes. The store showdown in planetary qualifier prize cards were cards that were weak. I'm not saying the art was weak. So like this unrefusable offer, I actually quite like this art on the promo card, but unrefusable offer is not a card that sees basically any competitive play right now. And it's difficult to predict what's going to be good, but I think we ended up with prize cards that weren't really ones that were really tearing up the meta at all, and I think people weren't that excited about it. I know I personally didn't bother to go to store showdowns because I wasn't interested in the prizes, and PQs were the competitive events that people were preparing for. And I think some other people may have thought the same thing. Store showdown style major attendance drops, but the future of the competitive play is looking pretty bright with a lot of interest in PQs. There's been a bunch of streaming. I'm actually going to be streaming another PQ on Saturday over at the McClunky Gaming channel. I think it's going to be very exciting. And I streamed like several other PQ events during the season, I was part of the casting and commentary on streams hosted by others. I wasn't the one doing all the camera work and all. So shout out to the people who do that. I know that's complicated and very cool. I know there's been some cool stuff from that from the Bucketheads, and I know that McClunky Gaming is the group that I was working with most frequently, where they were doing the camera setup for some of these PQs, and I and others would be casting, and I'm going to be working with them again on Saturday if all goes well. So that should be pretty fun for a PQ down in Florida. I think it's overall looking pretty good. And I do also want to give FFG a big shout out because there was some controversy after they came out with the FFG Live, their own stream discussing the planetary qualifier prizes, and people were pretty underwhelmed by the prizes. And also at that time, I think the prize kits weren't actually going to give a participation card to everyone who played the event, which people were not thrilled by. So FFG heard the feedback from the community and they went to increase the prizes after that. And I think that's a very positive development. And shows how responsive they've been to community feedback. This is, I think, probably the third time that there's been some issue that the community has really not liked about the organized play program, and FFG has been pretty quick to address it. The other two being before the game came out, I believe the floor rule said that you had to have cards of only one language in your deck, and a bunch of players from regions where the cards are available in multiple languages said, hey, this is going to be really bad. This is going to really limit the community. People aren't going to want to play in drafts that are in like a different language because they can't mix and match the cards. It's going to be bad for limited. It's going to be bad for trading. And the FFG heard those complaints, which I think were quite reasonable, and changed that policy so you are allowed to have cards in multiple languages in your deck. And then also in set 1, there was originally a policy where you could not use any sleeves or playmats that had art other than official Gamegenic Star Wars Unlimited sleeves. You could use like flat colors, but you couldn't use art sleeves unless they were official Gamegenic Star Wars Unlimited, I believe. This policy was like almost universally hated, and I think they amended that as well. I think that I think what they said was that or something like that was still going to be the rule for like official streams at their own big events, which is totally fair, but that they were going to allow other stuff as long as it wasn't inappropriate, at least like on the local level and so on. And I believe in big events as well, at least for games that aren't played on stream. So I think that was a very reasonable decision. And we haven't seen the like really big sponsored streams or whatever where that would be an issue in any case yet. Although I bet we'll see those in the future. So I think that organized play, there were a few stumbles during this set, but overall I think they had some big wins as well, and I'm pretty optimistic about the future of organized play for this game. The competitive meta was unfortunately a lot worse. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Boba Fett was already strong. He was probably the most successful leader in set 1. And he rose to new heights with this set. So over 50% of the PQs were won by Boba. That's a lot worse than set 1. In set 1, I think Boba was the most successful leader in the store showdowns, which were the most competitive event at that time. But I think that the percentage that he won was like somewhere between 25 and 30%, if I recall correctly. I might be misremembering, which is still pretty high, but it's very different than over 50%. And many leaders, both new and old, didn't see much competition at all. Of the new leaders, Rey, Kira, Bosk, and Young Han had some success, and they're not the only ones necessarily. There's some other stuff that's cool. I know there's a Cad Bane Tarkin Town deck that's like quite good against Sabine. I know there's been some people playing Gar, but overall I think it was an unfortunate meta for the game. I think it was worse than the first set. We didn't really, in set 1, Boba was very strong for a time, and we saw a pivot to these control decks that were handling him pretty well. In set 2, I don't know whether the control decks weren't as effective against him, whether people were just worried about the time rules, which can be difficult for control mirrors, whether people just didn't want to play the horrible mill-based control mirrors that you sometimes see in the game. But we didn't see the big shift to control to counter Boba that we perhaps saw in the first set. Boba continued to dominate, and he seems like he's poised to maybe be an issue for set 3 as well. I am not, I do not have any special insight into the balance team. I don't know who's even on the balance team. I don't even know if there is a balance team at this point. But if I ran the balance team, I would be looking at nerfs about now. I think that I think 2 seasons is enough, or 2 sets is enough. The first set, Boba was probably the strongest leader, but I don't think he was like overwhelmingly strong. He was just like a bit unbalanced. This set, he seemed pretty overwhelmingly strong, and it's still not at the worst level. It's still not at the like, if you're not playing Boba, you're wrong type level that has existed in some other games, where like a specific leader or specific army deck or whatever is so good that like other archetypes aren't valid. But nevertheless, I think Boba's at a point where it's time to start looking at nerfs. I think the ideal nerf would be to errata him to deploy on 6 resources. I think he would be much more in line with the rest of the game at that point. I don't know if they're willing to do balance errata in this game, but I think if this were a digital game, that change would already be in. And given that it's a physical game, I think they have to consider what options are open to them, what options they're willing to try, and either figure that out or figure something else out to rein him in a bit, because I do think it's having a negative effect on the meta and people's enthusiasm for organized play, which is overall high. I want to be clear. I'm not saying, it's killing the game, but I do think that it's dampening people's spirits a fair bit. And if you look at the percentages, it's too high. So that's what I think about the competitive meta. Unfortunately, not this set's strongest suit. The general sense of hype for the set has, I think, also been a bit lower. Metagame issues aside, some events have had lower attendance here. Store showdowns lost a lot of hype. I think that's partially due to the prizing, partially due to PQs existing. I'm not entirely sure, but I do think much of this is also actually thanks to theme, and that isn't something that I've heard emphasized as much. But I think this set was probably developed while The Mandalorian was still cool. Like, season 1 and season 2 of The Mandalorian, people thought were like really cool and good. And season 3 of The Mandalorian and Book of the Boba Fett they had a much less enthusiastic reception, and I think they've kind of tarnished the reputation of that series. And as a result, I don't know. I mean, I think they were probably making this set a few years ago. I think, it wasn't clear that community sentiment on those things was going to shift like that. And as a result, I think the theme ended up falling a bit flat here relative to expectations probably at the time that it was being developed. I do think that if this theme factor is in fact really important, that bodes well for set 3, because I think the Clone Wars are an era in Star Wars that a lot of people are very excited about, and getting to see that, I think, hopefully set 3 ends up being a big success gameplay wise, and the new mechanics are a hit and all that type of stuff. But I think that even if it's not, I think the theme factor is going to be stronger for them there than it was here. So overall, I think there was probably some less enthusiasm with this set compared to the first one, but it also wasn't a disaster. It also wasn't, we're all quitting the game, none of the events are firing, anything like that. No, there are still events going on and so on. It's just seemed a little less enthusiastic than it was with set 1. I do think the legendary prices and so on are also kind of part of this, because the appeal of winning cards at events is higher when boosters are worth more and so on. But that's another story, and I'm not an expert on all the economics and so on of it. So overall, what are my final thoughts on the set? All things considered, I think this was a cool set. I don't think it was quite at set 1's level, but I think it was a cool set. I tend to be competitive minded, so the meta issues are kind of big for me. But if events were really booming around me, I might just be like, whatever, the meta is not great right now, but they'll fix that at some point. However, it does seem like the overall hype levels were lower around me, and events weren't really booming in the same way they were with set 1. On the other hand, still sold well. If you look at the ICV2 data, it was still a product that was selling quite well. I don't think it was a huge success, but I don't think it was a disaster either. And I'm hoping that set 3 ends up with a bigger success for the game. I do think that this was probably quite profitable. I bet they sold a bunch of boxes, and they did not like crash the game completely or do anything like that. But overall, I think I am more impressed with the first set than I was with the second. We'll have to see what happens with set 3. I kind of predict that set 3 is going to be the biggest yet, but I think part of that is due to theme and them figuring out production and so on, so it might be kind of an unfair prediction. You know, we'll have to see what happens. But yeah, overall, set 2, I thought it was cool. I had fun, but I did end up thinking set 1 was a bit stronger. All right. Those are my thoughts on this set, but I'm curious what you guys thought. Did you guys think, oh no, actually this set was way better? Did you guys think, oh no, actually I think it was terrible? I'd be curious to hear in the comments below what you guys thought of Shadows of the Galaxy and how it stacked up to Spark of Rebellion, as well as what you're thinking about Twilight of the Republic. So that's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks to y'all for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. And if you are interested in seeing the last PQ of the season with live commentary from me as well as other casters, that's going to be over on the McClunky Gaming channel, which I will also link to in the video description below. I believe the coverage is going to start at about 7 a.m. Pacific on Saturday. So I am very excited for that, and yeah, hope to see some of you in the Twitch chat for that stream. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'm Tower Number 9, and I will catch you guys later.